Dower rights. Dower rights are something that comes up in Alberta real estate law all the time. And it's really important because there's some really extreme consequences if you don't follow things right. Now, dower rights come from legislation, which means the government created an act or a law that deals with people's houses, their homes. When do dower rights apply? Dower rights apply if there's one person on title to the property, that person is legally married, and if either of the parties have lived in the property since the time of the marriage. And to make things easier, we're going to just consider, because there's some case law like this, that if you've lived in the property, if you slept there even one night, either of the people, so you don't have to have both people living there, if either person lived there since the time of the marriage. So the purpose of the dower rights are to protect the spouse who's not on title to the property. It means that the person who's on title can't just go and sell the family home out from underneath their spouse. It means that, I joke about it being from way back when Farmer Joe comes into the city and gets all drunk up and he bets the family house away in a poker match or something. Now, that might be a little extreme, and the law is even older than that, but this is very old legislation that hasn't been touched a lot since like the 1950s. We're looking at it, the Alberta government is looking at changing it, but for right now, this is what we have, and it's been very consistent. So, as I said, dower rights are triggered, one person on title, that person is legally married, and if either person lived in the home. And in order to release dower rights, there's certain mechanisms that come up. One, a person can sign a dower release. A dower release is a document where the spouse who's not on title signs that I released all my dower rights to a person. It gets registered on the title to the property, and now the spouse who's on title can deal with it as they please. There's no requirement to get permission. It's good to know that those dower releases can be withdrawn at any time by the person who released their dower rights. So if the situation changed, they released dower rights just to make it easy for renting properties or getting mortgages or because they're out of town or something, and now they're going through a divorce, you can pull those out. So they can be discharged, and it's not a big deal to do that. Another way of releasing dower rights or dealing with dower rights is a dower consent. So let's say the spouse who's on title needs to refinance. It's one document, the mortgage, that the person has consent to. And so the spouse who's not on title has to appear without their spouse present. So there can't be any pressure. We're protecting that person. And they will sign off that they allow for that mortgage to be registered. A dower consent can be for an assignment of rents. A dower consent can be for something like a transfer of the property if you want to add somebody else to the property. And a little quirk of our law that even if a spouse is on title, wants to gift half the house to their spouse, the spouse still has to consent to the transfer of the ownership to themselves. It's a quirk, but it's there to protect people. It's very powerful. The other way of dower rights ending is if the relationship ends. And we're not talking about they break up. We're not talking about if they have a legal separation, which is not really any such thing. But even if you have a separation agreement that dower rights are dealt with, unless you have that dower release, you still have to get consent from each person. Now, all the dower rights are off as soon as the divorce happens. If the divorce is official, they're not legally married anymore, then there are no more dower rights. And just to be clear, dower rights are very, very different than equitable rights. So if you have a divorce situation, a person may be entitled to a lot of equity in the property, the value, the money that's there, but they don't have any dower rights. This would be an example like if you have a couple that bought 3 revenue properties throughout their marriage and neither of them have ever lived there, no dower rights, but their spouse would have an equitable interest in it. Conversely, you can also have situations where you have a person who's on title and they get married and they've lived in the house, but very short marriage. They're married for 2 weeks and then they decided they don't like each other anymore. So the person probably doesn't have a lot of equitable interest in the property, but dower rights still exist until they get divorced. So 2 very, very different concepts. And if you have questions, make sure you ask your lawyer. Now, someone could say, I want to deal with this. I don't want to have to involve my spouse. I'm just going to swear something wrong. I'm going to lie about dower rights. Very, very bad idea. The law provides protection for the spouse who's not on title, that if a person lies about their dower rights and evades them somehow, then the liability is 50% of the value of the property. So if you have a $600,000 home with a $500,000 mortgage, even though there's only $100,000 of equity and half the equity is $50,000, the person is entitled to half the value, $300,000. So you have fights in family law or they just ignore the family law stuff and just go after the dower interest when people have screwed around with that. So it's really important not to mess around. You can't just go to a new lawyer and say, oh, this is easier just to lie on my affidavit. I'll do that. You do not want to do that. It can be very, very expensive in terms of the financial consequences to you. Last, we want to talk about just common law couples. Because a common law couple is not legally married, dower rights don't protect the person who's not on title. So there is no protection there. It has to be legally married, and now you know all the basics. If you have questions, ask your lawyer. It's really important to know them to make sure that you protect yourself, your family, and you don't go offside any of our laws.